The town of Stonewell had always looked picture perfect from the outside. Red brick buildings, blooming dogwood trees lining the streets, and the sound of laughter drifting from cafes and bookstores. But beneath the town's polished surface was a rot that only the vulnerable could smell. Fallon Gray had once believed Stonewell was home. Her mother, Eloise, had run a modest antique shop on Main Street, and Fallon had grown up learning to dust-carved oak frames, polish vintage lockets, and translate the stories behind every object. They weren't rich, but they had love, and her mother's reputation as a kind, generous woman was widely known. But then came the fire. It happened in late spring, right after Fallon turned 17. A blaze broke out late one night at the antique shop. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the store was gone, reduced to smoldering ash. The fire spread to the attached apartment above, killing Eloise instantly in her sleep. Fallon, who had been spending the night at a friend's place, came running through the dark in pajamas, barefoot on the cold sidewalk, screaming her mother's name as the flames roared. The officials called it an electrical accident, faulty wiring, nothing suspicious, but Fallon never believed it. The insurance company refused the claim. Word around town quickly shifted. People whispered that maybe Eloise had been in debt, that maybe Fallon's mother had torched her own shop for money and got caught in the blaze. Fallon tried to scream the truth, to show documents, to talk about the men her mother had argued with just a week before. But no one listened. They didn't want to, because the men Eloise had argued with were untouchable, and at the center of them stood Wyatt Hawthorne, young, powerful, wealthy, the golden boy of Stonewell, the mayor's only son. Fallon remembered Wyatt from school. He was 2 years older, the kind of boy who walked the halls like he owned the air. Charming, calculating, and dangerous. He had inherited his father's smirk and his grandfather's ruthlessness, and he had set his eyes on her mother's property months before the fire. A real estate redevelopment deal had been quietly proposed. New condos and cafes to modernize the old town strip. Eloise had refused to sell. A week later, she was dead, and Fallon was alone. For 3 years, Fallon drifted between shelters, then foster care, and eventually disappeared. She changed her name, cut her hair, moved far away. No one in Stonewell ever saw her again. They forgot her. Or maybe they hoped she'd stay gone. But Fallon didn't vanish. She became someone else. She studied architecture and historical preservation. She worked in silence. She learned how cities moved behind closed doors. Permits, loopholes, manipulation. And she learned how people like Wyatt Hawthorne thrived. Through fear, control, and shadows. While he built his empire atop ashes, Fallon built her future with cold, burning precision. 7 years after the fire, Fallon returned to Stonewell under a new name, Serena Vale. Her appearance had changed, her hair longer, her posture straighter, her voice calm but edged like glass. No one recognized her, and that was exactly the plan. Wyatt Hawthorne, now head of Hawthorne and Cumber Development, was on the verge of announcing his most ambitious project yet, the Founders Plaza, a billion-dollar redevelopment that would demolish what little was left of the town's historical quarter, including the last standing wall of Fallon's mother's antique shop. And this time, he wouldn't ask for permission. The mayor, his father, had already pushed the permits through. But Wyatt didn't know that the new lead architect his team had just hired, the quiet, brilliant Serena Vale, was none other than Fallon Gray. She had come home, not to forgive, not to forget, but to watch his empire burn. Fallon, now Serena, moved through the polished corridors of Hawthorne & Co. like she'd always belonged there. Her office overlooked the town square, her credentials impeccable, and her demeanor so composed that no one questioned the quiet woman who spoke only when necessary and delivered flawless designs. Wyatt barely looked at her during meetings, brushing her off as just another name in the long list of yes people orbiting his ambition. That suited her just fine. In fact, she had counted on it. Her real plan had nothing to do with drawing buildings. She was here to dismantle one, brick by brick, name by name, lie by lie, and she had started the moment her offer letter was signed. Fallon spent her first few weeks mapping the infrastructure of Hawthorne & Co. Not the architecture, but the people, the consultants Wyatt bribed, the councilmen who turned their backs for a slice of redevelopment profits, the clerks who edited historical records. She tracked them all like blueprints, each one a beam supporting the empire that had stolen her mother's life. She didn't act quickly. This wasn't a fire. It was a quiet rot that would eat from the inside. She began by slipping documents into the right hands. An anonymous tip to a preservationist society about missing records in the town archive. A carefully worded email to a young investigative journalist in a nearby city. A forged invoice showing ghost properties bought under fake shell corporations, each one tracing back to Wyatt's desk. The cracks started small. Questions at town hall, a rumor spreading through the historical society. Then one morning, an article dropped. Is Stonewell selling its soul? It wasn't an attack, just a question. But the headline struck a chord. It pointed out the loss of heritage, the erasure of history. Fallon didn't have to accuse anyone. She simply let the evidence speak. Meanwhile, Wyatt stood at podiums and camera flashes, his smile still polished, his confidence unwavering. He threw charity galas, cut ribbons, but Fallon watched him closely and saw what others didn't. The way his eyes darted when someone asked about land deeds. The way his knuckles tightened when local businesses started pushing back. He felt it, the shift, the unraveling. One evening, Fallon returned to the charred remains of her mother's shop. All that was left was a fragment of brick wall, scorched black and hidden behind a construction tarp. She knelt beside it and placed her hand against the stone. This was where everything began, where the warmth of her childhood ended, and where Wyatt thought the truth had burned to nothing. She whispered her mother's name aloud, the first time she'd spoken it in years. Eloise. The wind moved through the empty lot like an answer. Fallon stood and turned her back on the ashes. She would not mourn anymore. She would make them remember. Her next move was direct. She requested a private meeting with Wyatt regarding an irregularity in the Founders Plaza Foundation. When she entered his office, he didn't even look up from his phone. "Serena, right? You're the new design lead." "I am," she said calmly. He waved her forward. "Don't bore me with permit drama. I've got that handled." She tilted her head, amused. "I'm sure you do." Something in her tone made him pause. He glanced up. For the first time, their eyes truly met. There was a flicker. Not recognition, yet, but something else. Discomfort. "Do I know you?" he asked, squinting slightly. "No," she said, her voice soft. "But you will." She handed him a folder and walked out before he could respond. Inside were floor plans, but not of Founders Plaza. They were blueprints of every dirty deal, every false signature, and every forced buyout he had ever orchestrated in Stonewell. Dated, labeled, indexed. Each page a mirror, a confession, a countdown. Wyatt stared at the folder for a long time, the air in the room tightening around him. Fallon didn't stop there. she arranged a closed-door meeting with the town's preservation board. Under her new identity, she filed a formal motion to classify the old downtown block, including her mother's shop ruins, as a protected historical site. She presented photos. She brought copies of Eloise Gray's shop ledger, community involvement, letters of protest she had once sent the mayor, documents Fallon had salvaged and hidden for years. The board was hesitant until the public got involved, because Fallon had also begun to speak, not openly, not as herself, but through blogs, forums, anonymous letters, signed only "The Daughter of the Ashes." She told her story without names, letting the emotion guide the words, and people listened. Older residents began to remember what had been lost. Shopkeepers spoke of Eloise's kindness. A retired firefighter, after reading one of the blogs, admitted he'd never believed the wiring story. Wyatt's name no longer inspired admiration. It triggered questions, and questions turned into doubt. Fallon could feel it, the tension, the slow shift of air around Wyatt Hawthorne's empire. For the first time in his career, he couldn't control the narrative. A week after she dropped the folder on his desk, a flurry of internal audits began. Behind closed doors, Wyatt's meetings ran longer. Staff members were quieter in the halls. Something was cracking, and Fallon was the one holding the chisel. But she wasn't done yet. One of her greatest weapons remained unseen. Alex Mercer, a young journalist she'd quietly mentored over email for nearly a year under the pseudonym Ash Witness. Smart, fearless, and hungry for truth, Alex had been publishing pieces on corporate corruption around small-town America, and now his spotlight was turning towards Stonewall. Fallon fed him documents, interviews, and angles so precisely timed, they felt like spontaneous discovery. All it took was one major leak to the regional press. Land transfers under ghost LLCs tied to Hawthorne & Co. And Stonewall's shiny redevelopment dream began to stink of something rotten. And Wyatt? He tried to fight back the only way he knew how. By tightening his grip, he doubled down on public appearances, launched PR campaigns, donated to schools and hospitals. He even staged a press conference at the site of Founders Plaza's groundbreaking, trying to win back the town's heart with hollow speeches and big smiles. But as Fallon stood in the crowd, tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, she watched the townspeople's faces. They weren't smiling anymore. They were listening, measuring, waiting. That same evening, Wyatt's father, Mayor Ellis Hawthorne, called an emergency town council meeting. Fallon attended, quiet in the back row. The mayor's voice was calm, but forced. He insisted the project would go on, that these baseless accusations were the work of disgruntled outsiders. Fallon stood up. She walked down the aisle, heels echoing, and handed the clerk a sealed envelope. Inside were signed contracts, not yet filed, that proved the Hawthorne family had been planning to demolish 3 protected sites illegally. Her voice was even as she said, "Outsiders don't have access to your private blueprints." The silence was thunderous. Mayor Hawthorne didn't speak another word. That night, Fallon walked the streets of Stonewall alone. The moonlight draped, the rooftops in silver. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt real, present, seen. But she knew the war wasn't over. The damage Wyatt had done stretched far beyond her family. He had buried dozens of lives under his ambition, and not all of them could be saved. Still, she pressed forward. A week later, a petition to protect the downtown district reached over 5,000 signatures. More than half the town's population, businesses that once bowed to Hawthorne & Co., began pulling out of the project. Fallon watched as Wyatt's name, once printed in gold on every corner office wall, was now followed by questions, accusations, and finally, indictments. Not for arson, there wasn't enough to convict, but for fraud, tax evasion, and illegal property seizures. There was a mountain, and then came the night everything changed. Fallon received an anonymous letter, handwritten, no return address. I know what really happened to your mother. Meet me behind the old train station. Midnight. She debated for hours whether to go. It could be a trap, but her instincts whispered otherwise. This wasn't Wyatt. This was someone else, someone with conscience. At 11:59 p.m., Fallon stood in the cold behind the station, coat wrapped tight, her breath rising in clouds. A figure stepped out from the shadows. An older man, late 60s, with tired eyes and a slight limp. I was a contractor, he said. They hired me to inspect the property next to your mother's shop. I saw what they did. I saw the accelerant, near the back wall. But they paid me to keep quiet. I told myself it wasn't my fault. Fallon's heart hammered. Why now? He looked at her with guilt, written deep into his bones. Because I saw your mother's face in every paper these past weeks, and then I saw yours. You look just like her. I couldn't carry it anymore. He handed her a flash drive. There's footage from a security camera across the alley. They never knew it existed. It's old, grainy, but it's enough. Fallon took it with trembling hands. That night, she watched the video. It was silent, flickering in black and white, but she saw them. 2 men, gloved, moving behind her mother's shop, just before the fire. One of them turned toward the camera. The footage paused, blurry, but the profile was unmistakable. Wyatt Hawthorne. Her mother hadn't died in an accident. She had been murdered. Fallon sat still, not crying, not breaking. She only whispered, "It's time." Fallon didn't sleep after watching the footage. She didn't need rest. She needed resolve. The grainy image of Wyatt's side profile etched itself into her mind. Proof that the golden boy of Stonewell wasn't just a corrupt businessman. He was a killer. And the town, Fallon realized, deserved to see it too. No veils, no courtrooms to delay the truth. She would reveal it where Wyatt had always ruled. In the court of public perception, she didn't rush. Her revenge had always been methodical, precise. So she waited until the day of the Founders Plaza groundbreaking ceremony, the event that was meant to solidify Wyatt's legacy. Fallon dressed in black. Not mourning, not dramatic. Just sharp, simple, deliberate. She pinned a silver antique brooch to her coat, the same one her mother wore every Sunday, and walked into the crowd gathered in front of the roped-off site. A podium had been erected in front of scaffolding, banners flapping with phrases like, "Revitalizing Stonewell," and "Built on Tradition." The irony almost made her laugh. Fallon spotted Alex Mercer, the journalist she'd guided in secret, standing near the front with a small camera crew. She gave him a brief nod. He returned it, understanding the signal. It was time. Wyatt stepped up to the microphone with practiced charm. Dressed in a navy suit, hair perfectly tousled, he flashed his dazzling smile. The cameras clicked. The audience clapped politely. And then he began. "My friends," he said, "today marks not just a new project, but a new era for Stonewell. A future built with pride, innovation, and unity." Fallon stepped forward. Her heels echoed across the wooden platform as she walked, straight toward him. The crowd murmured. Wyatt paused, confused. Then a flicker of recognition lit in his eyes. The mask slipped. "Serena," he said, uncertain. She took the microphone from his hand. No, she said calmly. My name is Fallon Gray. A gasp rolled through the crowd. I am the daughter of Eloise Gray. She continued. The woman who died in a fire 7 years ago in the building this man wanted to bulldoze into memory. Whispers swirled like smoke. Wyatt turned pale, but Fallon didn't flinch. I vanished after that night, she said, because I had no family left. Because no one listened when I said it wasn't an accident, that it was murder. She reached into her coat pocket and held up a flash drive. This, she said, is footage from the night my mother died. You'll see him. She pointed to Wyatt. Back behind her shop, minutes before the fire, gloves, cans of accelerant. It's not speculation anymore. It's fact. Wyatt moved toward her, eyes wide with panic. That's fake, he hissed. This is a stunt. Fallon turned toward the journalist. Play it. Alex clicked a button on a portable screen, and the grainy video lit up for all to see. Fallon said nothing. She let silence fill the space as the images flickered. Wyatt's figure, unmistakable even in poor resolution, stepping through shadows, with intention. The crowd, once polite, now turned tense and sharp. Someone yelled, "That's him!" Another voice shouted, "Call the police!" Wyatt backed away. "This is a lie. You can't prove." "Then sue me," Fallon said evenly. "Let's make it a public trial. Let the town watch every second." Wyatt froze. Because he knew. A courtroom meant cross-examination, subpoenas, scrutiny. And even if he could fight the arson charge, the fraud and corruption would bury him anyway. The mayor tried to intervene, stepping toward the stage, but the townspeople blocked his path. A woman from the Preservation Society Fallon had once met whispered, "It's over for them." The spell had broken. The fear Wyatt had used to control Stonewall had finally evaporated. Police arrived within the hour, not to arrest, yet, but to seize the footage, start formal investigations, and escort Wyatt from the podium, like a failed actor dragged from center stage. Fallon watched as he disappeared behind flashing lights, and then she turned to face the town. "My mother believed history mattered," she said, her voice rising, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. She died trying to protect this place. I won't let her name be buried under concrete and greed. And with that, Fallon Gray walked down from the platform, not in triumph, but in peace. The townspeople didn't cheer. They didn't rush her. They simply stepped aside, letting her pass with reverence. She wasn't a martyr. She wasn't a hero. She was the truth. The fallout was swift. Within days of the public reveal, Wyatt Hawthorne's company lost nearly all its investors. Projects were frozen mid-construction. State investigators arrived in Stonewall with questions Wyatt couldn't dance around. His father, the mayor, tried to shield him. But when it became clear that doing so would destroy his own office, he stepped back. Within weeks, Wyatt was indicted on charges of financial fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction, though the arson remained difficult to prosecute. Old evidence, faded memories. The court of public opinion had already cast its verdict. Stonewall exhaled for the first time in years. Fallon remained in town. She didn't flee after her victory, didn't relish in her enemy's ruin. She quietly rented a small apartment just blocks from where her mother's shop once stood. She walked past the broken lot each morning, still fenced off, still raw. But now, there was no longer the weight of silence pressing against it. Now people knew what it had meant, what had been taken. The Preservation Board reconvened, and with overwhelming support, approved Fallon's petition to declare the downtown block a protected site. But Fallon didn't stop there. She proposed something else, something lasting. On the land where her mother's shop had stood, she would build again, not a store, not a monument, but the Eloise Gray Center for Memory and Justice. A community, space where art, history, and voices could be preserved. A place where young people could learn their past, where old ones could speak their truth, where no one's story would be erased. The council approved it unanimously. Construction began in the spring, funded in part by a quiet donation from Alex Mercer's foundation. Fallon designed it herself, simple, elegant, filled with light. She restored what few bricks remained of the original building into the entryway, sealing them with protective glass. Visitors would step over history when they entered, not on it. The first event held at the center was small, a gathering of families, survivors of injustice, and old friends of her mother's who hadn't spoken her name in years. Fallon stood at the front beneath a newly installed plaque that read, "For Eloise Gray, who chose truth over silence." Even when it cost her everything, Fallon spoke that day, not about revenge, but about legacy. She didn't mention Wyatt. She didn't need to. His name no longer held weight in the town he once owned. After the crowd dispersed and the sun dipped low behind the hills, Fallon walked alone through the now quiet building. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished floor. In one corner, she had placed a framed photograph of her mother, the same one that used to sit behind the antique shop counter. Eloise smiled in it, her eyes kind, her hands mid-gesture, as if telling a story. Fallon stood before it for a long time. "You were right," she whispered. "They remember now." And as if in answer, a warm breeze drifted through the open windows, rustling the curtains gently. Fallon didn't believe in ghosts, but in that moment, she believed in presence. She stepped outside into the golden twilight. Children ran across the newly laid stone path, laughing. An old man tipped his hat to her as he passed. Across the street, a bookstore owner was painting a fresh sign, another restoration funded by the same grant that had revived her center. Stonewall was changing, not because someone had torn it down and built it again, but because someone had remembered what it once stood for. Fallon sat beneath the old elm tree across from the center, pulled a notebook from her coat, and began to write. Not as Serena Vale, the architect, nor as the shadowed figure seeking revenge, but as Fallon Gray, daughter of Eloise, survivor of the fire, keeper of memory. She didn't write about pain. She wrote about healing, about how reclaiming the truth was never clean or easy, but necessary, about how silence could be broken, not by shouting, but by speaking clearly and without fear. As the stars began to blink in the dusk sky, Fallon smiled. Not every wound needed to scar. Some could bloom instead.